Well, hi everybody. And as you've likely already guessed, the readings for this class consist of a largely decontextualized series of seminal arguments and ideas advanced by a range of artists, critics, and art historians. Now, in the abstract, that makes sense, but it can sometimes also be valuable to think about the specific contexts in which those ideas were originally advanced. And that's especially true of many of the writings published in the 50s and 60s, when the American art scene was largely dominated by two magazines, which foregrounded very different writing styles and interpretive strategies. The older of these journals was ARTNews, a venerable monthly publication that had been founded back in 1902. Following World War II, as the number of galleries in New York City began to mushroom, ARTNews offered the most comprehensive assessment of recent developments in the city's art world. Indeed, it typically tried to run at least a short review of every single show in the city. In the 1950s, the magazine came under the leadership of the energetic Tom Hess, a Yale graduate who had served as a fighter pilot during World War II, and in the late 1940s became a primary supporter of abstract expressionism. As his editorial duties at ARTNews expanded, the magazine soon began to reflect his preferences, running glowing reviews and lavish full-color photographs of paintings in the new idiom, at a time when black and white illustrations were still the industry norm. ARTNews was notable for a couple of other reasons as well. It soon began to run regular, feature-length articles that focused on a work being made in the studio, tracing it from conception to completion. In documenting the decisions that a painter or a sculptor made, the magazine was essentially trying to demystify modern art, to show it as a product of initial ideas, experimental forays, and instinctive and conscious choices, rather than as always already finished. And that attentiveness to the artistic process made sense, given that many of the writers who worked for ARTNews in the 1950s were active creators in their own right. Indeed, the magazine recruited and attracted a remarkable stable of leading young poets, from John Ashbery and Randall Jarrell to James Schuyler and Frank O'Hara. These poet critics were often personal friends of the artists whose work they addressed, and they understandably tended towards energetic, celebratory tones. They also openly embraced subjective and associative language, using metaphors and similes as they sought to convey the open-ended, mutable aspect of contemporary art at the time. ARTNews did a lot to popularize mid-century avant-garde art, but by around 1960, its sympathetic tone and arguably mushy wordsmithing had begun to strike many readers as cliched or even vacuous. A 1961 letter to the editor of ARTNews, for example, began, "Sir, that does it. It's time to pick up my pen and write you. I'm still waiting to read an article that ain't got a Leica followed by an as though in it. Look, fellows, either it is or it isn't." Importantly, such frustration was shared by Clement Greenberg, the powerful critic and modernist theorist, who found ARTNews analysis to be unsystematic and without rigor. And some of Greenberg's most promising disciples, who tended to be highly educated graduate students immersed in theory, furthered his critique of the magazine. As Barbara Rose, who was to become a leading art critic in the 60s herself, later put it, "We had been nauseated by what was passing for art writing. It was obviously total garbage, mental doodling by poets." Clearly then there was room for a new platform, and a monthly journal titled Artforum sought to fill that void. Founded in California in 1962, Artforum began as a regional West Coast magazine, but soon positioned itself as a nationally important alternative to ARTNews. It engaged more fully with new media, including photography and film, and it tended to promote hard-edged, descriptive writing that was rooted in objective observation rather than subjective response. And finally, it recruited a number of young, intellectually ambitious critics, whose writings reflected a remarkably intense and highbrow engagement with art. In 1967, Artforum moved to New York City, and still today it remains one of the most important venues for thoughtful writing about contemporary art. But 1967 was an important year for Artforum in another sense as well. From its inception, the magazine had shown an alertness to, or even a sympathy for, emerging trends. Its design was typical in this sense, the title fonts, and even some of the cover imagery of early issues was modeled on contemporary jazz albums, quietly linking Artforum to a vibrant form of musical innovation. And while its uniquely square format resembled record album covers, it also paralleled, in a basic way, the geometric forms that were beginning to serve as the basis of work by artists who would later be known as the minimalists. Artists such as Robert Morris and Donald Judd often employed cubes and prismatic forms and resisted the gestural expressionism of an earlier generation. Their heady brand of abstraction, rooted in Gestalt theory, naturally appealed to many of the critics who wrote for Artforum, and who were also seeking to craft a systematic and less open-ended brand of criticism. To many of the critics, that is, but not to all. For in 1967, Michael Fried, who had been mentored by Greenberg while at Princeton, wrote a remarkable, nuanced Jeremiad in which he complained that minimalism, or literalism as he called it, was effectively a kitschy, time-bound form of theater, and he contended that it thus violated some of Greenberg's fundamental postulates about modernist art. His essay, which was widely read and discussed in its time, still stands today as a remarkable moment in mid-century criticism, and it's certainly still well worth reading and thinking about it closely. But it's also worth remembering that it first appeared in Artforum, and thus formed part of an even larger discussion about what art could and should be, and about the specific forms that an ideal art criticism might take.